So one of the longest standing questions in, well, human philosophy, really, but also in physics, is why is there a difference between the future and the past? And philosophy, and especially theological thought, is replete with people considering the idea of existing outside of time, right? And sort of a lot of, really monotheistic philosophers, which this day, since, well, for a long time now, most theological thought is monotheistic, right? Will refer to God as existing outside of time. And, you know, there's lots of science fiction with thoughts about sort of existing outside of time, right? Most famously, the Feldorians in Slaughterhouse 5, they exist with a completely non-linear experience of time, right? They experience all of they're not they're not omniscient, right? They but they experience the entirety of their own existence uh, simultaneously, right? To them, there's no distinction between past and present. There is a difference, but they don't see sort of a flow of time through the present into the future, right? Which this is something I have spent a lot of my life thinking about. And it's actually not the thing that drew me into physics, but in terms of philosophical questions in physics that interest me, this has always been the thing that interests me most is why, what does time really mean? And of course, there's no real conclusive answers that we have. But I want to talk a little bit about how we think about it in physics and to some degree the history of how we thought about time in physics and in sort of natural philosophy, which is sort of the, well, predecessor to science, the modern science, really. Uh, because, right, I in physics, what physics is, right, is an attempt to describe the sort of processes in the universe in terms of quantifiable parameters, right? Things that we can assign numbers to, and to make accurate predictions about how things will change in time, right? That's what physics is. And so, theories of physics necessarily require a quantitative description of reality, and then a theory of physics that describes how that quantitative description will evolve and change in time. Right? And that's why physics grew out of sort of two schools converging in a way. And is like Isaac Newton, right, was famously both a scientist and something of an astrologer, right? In fact, he kind of represented the end of astrology being as seriously interwoven with astronomy, but he was himself very much was an astrologer. In addition to being a sort of a theoretical astronomer, um, did not conduct uh, extensive telescope surveys or anything like that. Although obviously he looked at the night sky, but he was not not really an experimentalist. And so, really, classical, when a physicist says classical, what we mean is not quantum. We mean everything in the paradigm of what Isaac Newton came up with, but before the paradigm of quantum mechanics that came in the early 20th century. And so classical mechanics is kind of an odd thing, right? Because for most of human history, if you said, I have a way to use math to describe exactly something that's going to happen in the future, people would be like, no, you don't. You have some, nonsense that you've come up with. And we later found out that indeed classical mechanics actually isn't fundamentally true. But what I've kind of started to realize in the last few years is how that classical mechanics was actually the anomaly, right? Sort of most human philosophy throughout history thought of, the future is something inherently impossible to exactly predict. Although, again, that there's not you're not going to find a consistency on that, right? There's from individual to individual and society to society, mostly individual to individual. There's going to be variation, and there's variation in schools of thought, right? And different philosophies that people have. Some of which said people said could predict the future, some of which couldn't. Right? Probably most famously in my mind, in theologians, in sort of in the Muslim world as well as the Christian, quote unquote Muslim world and quote unquote Christian world. There's a continuum of these things, but nonetheless, would debate basically, if God is omniscient, does that mean that the future is predetermined? And on the one hand, you would argue that if God is truly omniscient, he should know the future. And on the other hand, you argue that if humans have free will, then there's no way that the future could be fully determined, and even God couldn't know it. And this is a debate that was never resolved, and I'm not sure will be resolved. But along comes this thing called physics in the 17th century, right, where Isaac Newton says, actually, you can predict the future by looking at the stars, right? Because again, Isaac Newton was in many ways the last great astrologer. And indeed, what he came up with was a theory that mathematically, quantitatively predicted in terms of how the planets move in the night sky in their orbits and ultimately change their positions relative to the stars, how you can describe ordinary actions on Earth, right? The trajectory of some moving object, falling from well, these are both actually in physics considered free fall. If you toss something up in the air and let it come back down, that's also free fall, accelerating under gravity. But trajectory of something through space down here on Earth can be described with the exact same mathematics as the trajectories of the planets. And that was his great insight. And that, it turns out, is true, right? That there are the mechanics that govern the celestial bodies are exactly the same as the mechanics that govern things on Earth. And indeed, we have truly confirmed this by sending spacecraft, machines that we have built using our understanding of physics as well as other fields of science, obviously chemistry and even biology, right? To put together a machine that we can then send to one of these celestial bodies and then land there and take pictures on it and confirm using various instruments brought with it that indeed the laws of physics are exactly the same there. And also, of course, there's famously on Apollo 15, right? They even took a hammer and a feather and they dropped them on the moon. They dropped at the same rate, confirming that Galileo's theory was correct and Isaac Newton's quantification and codification of that was correct. And so it's very strange that we as physicists often sort of lament the loss of determinism, right? Because determinism is, if you don't know, right, it's just the idea that, right, the future is fully determined by the past, right, as opposed to know other theories that state that the future is always uncertain. And indeed, it turns out in quantum mechanics that most interpretations of quantum mechanics, in fact, pretty much any sane interpretation of quantum mechanics, to be honest, says that the future is not fully determined, which actually is just a reversion to how things used to be in most philosophies throughout history. Because generally, people, again, some people thought the future is predetermined, and you could go to an oracle, they could tell you the exact future. But generally, the most philosophies consider the future to be indeterminate because humans have free will, and there's also always just kind of these random factors. And so, you know, it's very odd to me that we as physicists got so attached to that idea that you could exactly predict the future. But it's sort of fits into this other paradigm that we think about, which is that you know there's basically two ways you can think out, right? There's so-called eternalism and there's presentism, right? And eternalism sort of fits more into this sort of thing I've always been fascinated with, the idea of being able to experience time from without, right? The idea that you can describe time as being some like manifold structure, right? As a as you can describe, there's the beginning of time and the end of time, and you can, lay out like on a literal timeline, right? And so the timeline is a sort of a eternalist way of looking at temporal temporal processes. Time moves forward. Versus presentism is just the way that we ordinarily experience time. Stating that time is that the nature of time is the way we ordinarily experience it. Right? That time is just this thing where we exist in the present. The past is something we remember, and the future is something that we anticipate, but that doesn't exist yet. Right? And we've never resolved which of those two things more accurately describes reality, and I'm not sure we ever will. But it has this sort of grip on my mind and on my heart, in no small part because it's deeply tied to these philosophical questions of what do our choices really mean, and what is the sort of course of our life, right? Is our life predetermined or is it ever changing? And to what extent are our decisions ultimately going to bear out how our life plays out versus to what extent are we just sort of, you know, reading lines in the play of our life, right? And it's not clear. Ironically, after all these years, I'm not even sure I would want to know the answer, at least not while I'm still alive. Perhaps there's something beyond the veil where we all is revealed, and I like that thought, and I generally believe that that's the case. Um, People who experience near death experiences often say that their life flashes before their eyes, and that it's not like a linear sequence. It's this like instantaneous thing where you sort of see the entire process, and that's in a near death experience. I mean, who knows what that really means? It could be that that's just what the brain experiences when it's getting low on electrical activity, and it's just more efficient to do it that way. But maybe that's the case, and that there's actually something really deep to that fact, right? Who knows? I'm not looking to rush finding out. Well, at least I get very sad. Don't get me wrong, but trying not to look to rush the process. Um, but I don't know, like. It's very interesting to me that in physics we even though we have realized that the universe really isn't deterministic, a lot of people are so desperate to recover determinism that they are willing to resort to things like Everettian many worlds and parallel universes, right? And so desperate is the physicist to recover determinism that we will invent a parallel universe rather than admit that we just can't predict the future. Which is kind of like, if you asked any idiot from all of human history, like, hey dude, can you predict the future? It'd be like, no. Right? And so it's kind of funny to me, but I don't know. It's um it's 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 not clear why there is a such a difference between past, future, and present that we experience, but it's clear that our experience of time means something, right? And And I don't know as I even want the answer, but I don't think I want to stop asking the question either, right? Is like, what is the true nature of time, right? Is there a predetermined course of events, or is it sort of being generated on the fly? And the answer does seem to be that there are certain broad strokes events that are more or less predictable, right? And in fact, if you take not interpretations of quantum mechanics, but if you just take the theory of quantum mechanics literally, what it says is that reality is probabilistic, right? There is a random nature to events, at least in terms of our ability to predict them. Not getting into whether or not free will exists, I think it does, but that question aside, but if you're trying to make predictions about the future, what you will inevitably find is that you can't predict the exact outcome, you can only predict probabilities, and that if you want to calculate how those probabilities change in time, which is the closest thing to predicting the future that you can actually do, there are deterministic equations of motion that describe how a distribution of probabilities change in time. But the way that you do that calculation is very counterintuitive and funky, and involves imaginary numbers having a physical reality to them in ways that are very, very strange. And because if you know anything about quantum mechanics, there's the fact that there's the wave function, right? And the strange thing about the wave function is that there's information that is required to make the probability calculation, right? You need to know, in order to accurately calculate the time evolution of a probability distribution, you need to take into account the imaginary or the complex phase of the wave function. But the complex phase is itself not a is a non-physical piece of information, right? And so there's a physical reality to complex numbers because they affect something that is physical, which is the probability distribution. But I guess the complex numbers themselves are non-physical, right? And the wave function, or really the phase of the wave function is non-physical, but the interference of the phase is physical. And so that's in a sense unsurprising when I start to think about it this way. But you know, it's unsurprising, but still very I don't know. I don't want to say profound because it'd be like dude, whoa. But it kind of is, right? It's incredible that it turns out that the universe cannot be predicted exactly, but it can be predicted approximately. Um, and there are as a result of that, right? If you average together enough events because of how probability works, you do essentially get some things that are essentially deterministic. Um, and then you get probabilities on probabilities, right? Which is a real thing, right? It's called second order statistics, right? It's basically you can imagine if you have a like a probability distribution with an average and a standard deviation. Well, there's also a standard deviation on that standard deviation, right? You don't actually know for sure that that's the real standard deviation. Um, and so it's I don't know, the universe is an ever fascinating place, um, and I'm sort of leaving out all of the times that I've sort of laid awake, horrified by the nature of reality. Because I and now I'm well now I'm not horrified. I'm just horrified by how miserable my life is because I feel trapped in the present where I'm, what I'm 36. I'm unemployed, although I'm by the grace of God and by my, boss and colleagues being really incredible people. I am not fired because, I'm very fortunate and they're very kind people. And but nonetheless, it's like I'm an unemployed loser. I'm 36. I live with my parents. I, hardly have any friends that I see in real life. I have been single for like 11 years. I, have my PhD as my only sort of quasi leg to stand on. Um, but I don't know. It's in this moment though I am reasonably happy because I am talking about something that I love, which is this human endeavor to understand this beautiful thing called the universe that we live in, and the fact that it's just it's like possible, not possible to predict the future, right? And I don't know. I feel trapped in the present, but at this particular present isn't too bad. But then, of course, in a couple of hours, I'll be trapped in a present that doesn't feel so great. So that makes me want to think about the eternalist nature of reality and think, look at the overall arc of my life. But then, other moments you got to live in the moment, and so it's neither presentism nor eternalism is true either, right? It's sort of to use a quantum term, the universe seems to be in a superposition of the two. Uh, and I don't know as I would want to collapse that, which collapsing wave function is a whole other loaded thing. But anyways, this is really just to have a thing to talk about and upload something. So I'll try to do. I keep saying I'll do a more serious project in the near future, but hopefully I will. So anyways, peace.